This is the BioCentury Show.
The BioCentury Show is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. Join BioCentury on the road to network, partner, and debate with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal making and investment. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information.
Hello and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I am Simone Fishburn, Editor-in-Chief at BioCentury. I am happy to be joined today by Aoife Brennan, CEO of Climb Bio. Aoife joined Climb Bio in June after serving as CMO and then CEO of Synlogic. Before that, she spent 5 years at Biogen, reaching the role of VP of its Rare Disease Innovation Unit. And we're going to dig into some of the dynamics that have guided the path, Aoife, and what you've learned. But I do want to start with taking the temperature of this moment in biotech. We have a range of people on the show. We haven't had so many small company CEOs recently. And so I think that for us to hear from a company like yours, from the CEO, what you are thinking about in the environment. We are hopefully, we will see, at the tail end of a biotech winter. We hope that. I'm sure you hope that. And it's come after, yeah. So that winter came after a long and sunny summer. So just tell us, how are you and your sort of peer CEOs and executives looking at this environment as we enter 2025?
Yeah, I think it's, we've kind of developed a lot of resilience and grit because first it was the COVID pandemic. While the markets were great, it was a challenging operating environment for CEOs. And then, of course, we've had 3 years of a very challenging financing environment with lots of layoffs and programs being deprioritized and challenging trade-off decisions. And I think we've kind of reached a point of everyone's expecting that it will get better, but also preparing for it not to be the case. Because I think this time last year, we were hopeful that JP Morgan was going to bring a new enthusiasm, new opportunity in the new year, and it kind of didn't materialize. And I think the year prior, there was probably great hope around this time of the year as well. So I think, we've gotten to the point of being hopeful, but also being, realistic that we have to actually build our companies and have operating plans that take into account that things may continue in this vein for longer than we would wish for them to continue. I think we've gotten used to curveballs being thrown, that kind of put things off track. There's just lots of uncertainty in the world. And even in a situation where interest rates seem to be coming down and trending in the right direction, there are lots of other uncertainties, right? With a new administration coming in, and uncertainty about the regulatory environment and lots of other things. So I think CEOs as a group have become super resilient over the last couple of years and ready for different eventualities and curveballs to come our way, which I think is actually a really healthy way to operate. They say only the paranoid survive. And I think you got to hold that mantra of even on a good day, you have to kind of cherish it and be like, okay, this feels like a good day. We've gotten some data back, or we've had a result that, is great. But, tomorrow things might be terrible again. So you kind of have that, mentality of just expecting to be smacked in the face all the time. And that's actually a healthy way to live, I think, in a lot of ways, because if you expect it and it happens, it's kind of, that's fine. It's kind of like the Stockdale paradox, right? But if you're overly optimistic sometimes, it can kind of crush you. Whereas if you expect that things are going to be difficult, you can actually bear with it and continue to persevere.
So I want to come back to some of that resilience and, only the paranoid survive in a minute. But I do want to sort of talk a little bit about your decision. Now, we'll talk about Synlogic and the learnings of that. You'd been CEO there. But now you're in a position, right, where you have to, and I'm assuming you got a bunch of offers as well, you have to decide what company you're going to work for. So how did you go about finding and choosing, or them finding you, Climb Bio? What is the kind of company that you did and didn't want to run, and why?
So after we went through the difficult decision of winding down SynLogic, you get a tremendous amount of outreach. I mean, it's a wonderful thing about our community is that almost everybody worth their salt has been through it before. And, I got an amazing amount of outreach from people, offering support, friends kind of, I'm hopping into an Uber, I have a bottle of gin, I'm coming over to your house kind of thing, which was great. It was just an amazingly supportive time. People were very supportive. And everybody wants to give you advice about what you should do. And, I think one of the best pieces of advice was just not to rush into something, not to close the window, not to decide, okay, this is the kind of company I want to do next, or, I'm only going to work in this stage, or I'm only going to look for a Series B, but to kind of keep things open for as long as possible. And it was difficult because, CEOs tend to be decisive, tend to like to make quick decisions and to move on things. We have a bias towards action where you always want to, kind of be doing something and feel like you're moving the ball and being useful. But kind of taking that time, I think, was a really important piece of advice that I received. And things start to become clearer as you listen and hear things without necessarily feeling compelled to act on them. It's okay to actually listen and learn and have the decks come to you and review them without necessarily feeling like you have to answer yes or no to each opportunity, but actually taking the opportunity just to be open and to seeing what's out there and having lots of open meetings with people and exploring. And through that, I think there were a couple of things that came to be. Number one thing was, the importance of the people that you're working with. And, I think having been through success and failure, right, having the right people around you can just make so much of a difference, to both of those. Success is never sweet if you are not with people that you really enjoy celebrating with. And, difficulty and failure is devastating when you have this compounded effect of being surrounded by people who make it even more difficult. So I knew that was going to be a really important driver for me. And the fact that I was coming into Climb with kind of this white sheet of paper and being able to build that team. And, the investors were great and being very open to, allowing me to choose a chairman or to have an influence on who the chairman of the company was going to be. And being very, very open with me around kind of my vision for building the company, rather than kind of slotting me into
you
a
went
role
from
that was
public. So a couple of things. You went from a public company and stayed with another public company, right? Which is, brings its own kind of challenges. Your last company, though, was a platform company. Now you're in a single asset or pipeline and an asset company. So talk about that kind of decision tree, the issues, and you're willing to be, the CEO of a public company is a very different beast from private one. And your sort of whole technology base is very different. Can you talk a little bit about that decision tree?
Sure. I mean, I think the public versus private was secondary for me. Some of the primary drivers were really around the technology. I knew I needed to be at a kind of an asset-focused company. I'm a drug developer, first and foremost, and being at a company that had at least programs and products that were in that kind of 1 year pre-IND to, proof of concept was kind of the zone I have the most fun in. So very, very early platforms where it's really about working out kinks in the technology. Those were less attractive for me. I mean, I came up as an R&D girl. That's where my passion is. I love clinical trials and development. And so I think once you kind of have the tent poles of what are the real drivers, you realize that, a lot of other things are just secondary. Yeah, sure, it's, there's pros and cons of being public and private. Sometimes it's nice to be able to kind of quote unquote hide as a private company CEO for a while, having kind of rotated off a public company assignment. But all those things were kind of secondary. I think having the right team, the right science, a program that was at the right stage of development, that was really important. And I did not want to have to build my own GMP manufacturing facility again. That was another important component. Having a platform or working with the modality that had been validated so that if lightning strikes and you do get the biology right and you get efficacy, that that this is something that can scale and be commercialized already, that someone's worked out those kinks was another really important, an attractive component.
So we should probably explain that, or maybe you can explain, Synlogic had sort of compound risks in that way, right? Because it was exploring a new modality with microbiome and new biology. So, maybe you can just sort of spell that out for what you went from and to.
Yes, sure. So Synlogic, the prior company I was CEO of, I actually joined when it was a private company. It was had just raised a B at the time when I joined as Chief Medical Officer. We were pursuing engineered bacteria as therapeutics for rare metabolic disease, a very compelling story, a very high science platform. And our lead programs showed a lot of promise early in development, but a lot of the work to commercialize these very complex biologics is still kind of being worked out, right? How to scale them, how to understand critical quality attributes, the assays that really translate to, from what you see in the lab to what's really important in vivo in humans. Those things are still evolving and we're still learning how to kind of commercialize and manufacture this platform. So, it kind of compounded, you're right, some of the risks inherent in developing something new. The rewards are huge because it allows you to advance science and do something amazing if it can work out. But in a small company with limited resources, developing programs on top of a novel platform and modality is just incredibly challenging. And when you throw that into a landscape with limited funding, it's just becomes a really, really difficult kind of situation to operate in, right? In a situation where, funding is plentiful, those compound risks are maybe something you can iterate on and move forward. And I do think that field will evolve. We'll get there eventually. It will probably take a couple of turns before we actually work out all the kinks and get it to a place where we can really exploit some of the interesting biology there, but we're not there today.
So I'm going to now switch to, or carry that through rather than switch to Climb Bio. So you've got a monoclonal antibody, a very, very well established modality, right? So you've removed that risk, right? Boring but you are an incredibly hot area with I&I, immunity and inflammation, and specifically going after B-cell diseases, where there's now this sort of surge of interest in new modalities against CD19, which is the target of your monoclonal, right, of your mAb. You've got CAR Ts and bispecifics. And so now I should also add that there is actually a background in your field, right, of rituximab, which is CD20, but also trying to address some of the same diseases by a pretty similar philosophy, right? So can you talk, you've exchanged one kind of risk for another, which is a competitive risk, right? Talk a little bit about where your product fits into that landscape and what your trade-offs are.
For sure. So number one, I think there's two different components of what we're doing. Number one thing is the B-cell target. And of course, there are like 4 or 5 different targets that people are pursuing on B cells. You have BCMA on the plasma cell, you have CD38, there are CD20 you just mentioned. So CD19 is the one that we've chosen. We do believe that it's the most interesting because of its expression profile in the B cell throughout B cell lineage. It spares the plasma cell. It's expressed pretty much on all of the other subsets of B cells. So we do think it's probably the best target in terms of B cell targeting for B cell mediated diseases. And so I think it's no surprise that there are multiple different modalities pursuing CD19 as a target. And some of the most interesting data, I think, that's been developed in autoantibody mediated diseases has been from CD19 programs generally. So I think it's becoming much hotter. I think it's kind of moved ahead of some of the other B cell targets in terms of its interest based on some of the clinical validation that has occurred just this year alone. I think there are many compelling data sets. So then I think it gets to the second axis, which is axis, which is, well, how do you address that, right? Which modality is the right modality to impact CD19? And we know it's differentiated from CD20. You know, I think that's the field is pretty much aligned that these are, you know, you can, it's not just old wine in new barrels. It really does have differential clinical activity. So I think then you come to the modality. And, you know, CAR T is a really interesting modality for sure. There's really compelling data in small subsets of patients that have been put forth. I think there's probably some more data being presented as we speak at ASH. But I think CAR T will probably remain limited to a small subset of patients with severe disease. When you think about...
There's bispecifics as well.
T-cell engagers for sure.
Right, T-cell engagers.
There's a number. There's a number. So you have kind of CAR Ts on one end of the spectrum. Then I think you have allo NK and allo CAR T kind of one step over. Then you have T-cell engagers, and then you have the naked monoclonal antibodies. And I think when you look across all of those modalities, the modality that is the best validation is the naked antibody. There are multiple naked antibodies approved. We know how to manufacture them. The safety record has been established. And there's only one other naked antibody in the I&I space in development, and that's Uplizna, which is inebilizumab, which is Amgen's product, that has been approved now in NMOSD. And they've just put up stunning data in two other diseases, myasthenia gravis and IgG4-RD.
So how are you competing with them?
So they're in very rare neurological indications, pretty much. We believe that the potential for impact is much broader than the subset of diseases that they have pursued. And so we're kind of the next molecule coming along in development. We have some molecular differences in terms of the engineering of the antibody itself. But I think what's more interesting as a clinical developer is how we can think about learning from their program and think about dosing and making sure that we get the right dose that doesn't leave any efficacy on the table, how we can think about finding the right patients who are going to really have the best benefit from this approach, and how we can think about developing into areas of unmet need that haven't been addressed by their program. Because I think as kind of the second naked monoclone coming along, we really do have an amazing opportunity to do something that's kind of new and unique. So I think we see, while CD19 as a space is crowded, there are multiple CAR T programs and T-cell engagers. There aren't that many companies pursuing, you know, a little old boring antibody like we are. And so sometimes, you know, boring is okay.
Tell your investors that you shouldn't necessarily use your...
You know what? If I'm an investor, I kind of like boring. You know how many of these companies have blown up in the last 3 years? How many of the sexy science projects have blown up in the last couple of years? Like, boring's not bad.
All right. So that's a great place. We're going to take a very brief pause and we'll be back in a minute. I'm going to pick up on what we've learned and why boring isn't bad. Thank you.
For 3 decades, BioCentury has helped biopharma executives and investors make business-critical decisions and build larger networks with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our goals are simple: gather the right people in the room to partner, network, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. BioCentury's upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal-making and investment. We hope to see you on the road at an upcoming BioCentury event. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information and to register.
Hello, we are back at the BioCentury Show with Aoife Brennan, CEO of Climb Bio. So, Aoife, I want to continue with what we were talking about before the break and why your investors will be happy with a naked monoclonal antibody, what you call a boring technology. I would call it validated rather than that. But I want to come to this thing. So you have a very asset-centric company, right, as opposed to a platform one. And there was previously this wave of platform companies, and especially big platform companies, heavily funded, very ambitious. The bear market has really, I think, forced this focus on lead assets in particular, and you know, maybe created more grounds for companies like yours. Do you think that what you've just talked about in terms of investors sort of maybe congregating around some more validated things. Is there a new era of discipline? You talked earlier on about resilience, and I want to talk about discipline. Do you think that that is something that is going to last, or when the money flows, do you think that we will revert to type?
It's hard for me to tell. I think genetically, I was programmed to be like a farmer's wife, like I'm Irish. I grew up in rural Ireland, so I'm always going to be. I'm
You
always
mean
going to.
farmer with an FAR rather than a PHR?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's far from pharma, PHRMA. I was reared. No, it's the other kind of pharma. But so I guess I'll always have one way of operating, which is kind of like, holy moly, you're spending 100,000 on a employee handbook and you're like 10 years away from having a clinical asset. That to me always felt weird. Like I couldn't just never bring myself to do something like that. But you do see that, right? This kind of build it and they will come, big companies. And for a while, it seemed like that was being valued. There is kind of this cycle of big fancy office, you attract talent that, kind of creates this flywheel. I guess the theory is it kind of creates this flywheel effect, right? It becomes a cool place to work. You attract talent, that creates value. Obviously, we've seen that, the tide has gone out and a lot of those companies had no swimwear on, right? So I think that's we've learned that lesson. Will it never happen again? I don't think so, right? Because I think it's just inevitable that things get frothy and we start to overspend and we lose track of like the fundamentals of like what's really building value, what's really de-risking this asset, this science, this program. And it's very, very challenging to retain discipline when you see left and right. You're in these offices with, company on the left is, doing X, Y, and Z, company on the right is doing, employees have expectations around, really big benefits packages and different things. It just becomes challenging to remain disciplined, and to kind of hold that. So do I expect that this kind of big platforms overspending, overbuilding small companies will happen again? I think it probably will. I think it's kind of inevitable. It's kind of the cycle of life that we go through these feast and famine periods and never seem to learn the lesson. Certainly that's the experience of people who've lived through far more of these cycles than I have. I think Bruce Booth wrote a nice blog about his experience being through a couple of these cycles at Atlas since he's been investing there. That was interesting to read. So I expect that, yes, we will probably forget the lesson.
I think it's relevant because, within that, we've got some you talked about resilient CEOs, the ones who've made it through, but obviously, some good companies didn't, and not only because of management. But I also want to talk, about the employee environment and decision-making cultures. You had to shut us in Logic recently after a phase 3 miss, right? And, we've seen a lot of companies stumble along and pivot, try something else, try all sorts of ways of staying alive. People don't often talk about the things that don't work out, but you've been quite open about it. So can you talk us through that, process of making a decision, deciding what the fate of the company would be, and then communicating it?
Yeah, so we had, it was a very, very challenging time. I think one of the most important lessons I learned that was positive was the importance of scenario planning. And that was something we did up front as a management team, really thinking through, often people will say, oh, it's too scary, you'll frighten others on the team away if you talk about potential downside scenarios. Your management team will all leave if you talk about a potential for failure. I actually found that the opposite is the case because often people are thinking about it. And if you don't speak openly, particularly at the management team level, you lose authenticity, or you lose trust. And being able to talk about, okay, here's what success looks like, here's what base case looks like, here's what happens in a negative scenario, just takes so much tension out of the room. It kind of has this paradox, right? That sometimes if you face fear, failure, and kind of be able to talk about it and process it before it happens, it really just takes all of the anxiety away. So then I think when we had that discipline up front of kind of processing and understanding, and lots of whiteboard, drawing on the walls of, here are outcomes, and have everyone around the table talk about, what their fears and what their thoughts were on potential scenarios. And so when we turned over the card, one thing we heard from people was, wow, you made that decision really quickly. Well, we had already kind of done a lot of that pre-work, and we'd also processed a lot of the emotions, associated with that, so that when we turned the card over, sure, there was disappointment, but we were also able to quickly move to, what do we need to do from an actions perspective to make sure that we did the right thing by patients, by the investigators, by employees, by investors. So we kind of had that piece was ready to go. Whereas, I think had we not done that pre-work, I think it would have been a much more challenging situation, because you're managing disclosure at a public company. You don't have, weeks to process. You have to manage communications very quickly. And trying to manage all of that while you're also managing your own process and your own grieving process, I think would have been very, very difficult to do. So I do think scenario planning and pre-working before obviously things happen all the time that are unexpected, but to the extent that you can anticipate, for instance, trial readouts, in our case, it was an interim analysis that we knew the timing, we were planning, we were in charge, we could control. So doing that kind of scenario planning ahead of times, I think is really critical for companies going through these kinds of things.
And now you have brought in Doug Williams as your chair. You and Doug previously worked at Biogen, as I understand, right? And Doug Williams, to remind people, he also just was CEO of Kodiak, and now is actually in a new company, Triarm. Those are real platform companies, right? So very different from your straight-laced monoclonal antibody. To what degree, as you build your management team, is it helpful to have people you've worked with before versus really wanting new blood and new relationships? Do you think that there's sort of a danger in too much kind of insider thinking? Talk about that decision process.
Yeah, so the way the Climb came about was pretty unique in that we were formed by Eliem Therapeutics, was an existing kind of neuroscience company that acquired Tenet Medicines that had the asset in it, but Eliem didn't really have a management team. Tenet Medicines didn't really have a full-time management team. So we were starting from scratch, a public company, clinical asset, initiating 3 clinical
And money
trials.
through 2027?
Money through 27. We were fortunate to raise a PIPE at 120 million PIPE. And then the Eliem company already had 100 million in it. So we had lots of financial resources when the company came together, but we didn't have people. So unlike, another company
a lot
where
of people would like to be in those shoes, money and no,
it's stressful when you're wearing like every hat on the management team for like a couple of weeks. But anyway, so we had it was a very unique scenario. We needed to stand up a management team in very short order, because it's not like you can just, not do your filings or, hide for 6 months as you get your act together. We really had to move quickly. And I think being able to draw on both new as well as existing relationships was really critical to success in kind of getting the company up and running over the summertime. So, for instance, I hired Brett Kaplan. I didn't know Brett before, but we've quickly become very close colleagues. It feels like we've worked together for 5 years. But and he was completely new to me. We hadn't worked.
And he's your COO and CFO.
COO, yes. He's a background in finance. He's been a previous CFO at 2 prior companies and has worked on Wall Street and raised capital. So he was a great partner in terms of building the kind of G&A side of the company in short order. And so the kind of having a balance of known and new, and making sure that we're not inheriting the culture of another organization, because I agree with you, that can be very unhealthy. It can also be very unhealthy to have like an in crowd where you hire a full team from a prior company. I've seen that happen, and I don't think that's a healthy thing. But having people that you trust and have worked before can really make that kind of onboarding and that time to full trust really, speed it up a lot. For instance, Doug and I hadn't worked together for probably over 10 years. He had left Biogen before I left, but we had a good working relationship. And when I made my shortlist of the people that I wanted to be the chair of the company, having somebody who'd been a prior CEO and had been through ups and downs was just really, really important for me. I had an amazing relationship with my prior chair, Peter Barrett at Atlas, and having somebody that, I thought I could really partner well with through, back to the resilience topic again, right? Somebody who's had some scar tissue, who's been through a lot, just makes so much difference when you need to be like, wow, things are going sideways here, or we've hit a bump, or something unexpected has happened. And also being able to keep you grounded when things are going well. I mean, I think that's also just as important. And if you know Doug, you know that he is like steady Eddie. It's very, very difficult to ruffle him. So I think he's a great chair, and I'm really looking forward to working with him and continuing to build the company with him.
Well, we're out of time, but this has been really interesting. We are looking forward to seeing how Climb Bio and your leadership moves forward. And I guess in the meanwhile, I will wish you a happy holidays and all the best for 2025.
Happy holidays, Simone.
Thank you.
The BioCentury Show is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. Join BioCentury on the road to network, partner, and debate with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal making and investment. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information.